So we saw last time in the prologue a version of really what is the whole problem of the Agamemnon. So the prologue splits in two. It has 38 lines. The first 20 lines, the watchman on top of the house is looking up at the heavens, expresses his boredom at the unchanging cyclical character of things that are eternal. And then lines 21 through 38, he sees the signal fire, it catches his interest. We see that he sort of wakes up because something has happened that's important from a human point of view. Now, this is meant, I think, to be mirrored. It's sort of unprecedented in Greek tragedy to have somebody sitting on top of the house in the first scene. It's mirrored by his position as a sort of mean. He looks up at the various constellations. He looks down on the house of Atreus. And so the problem, in a way, of the prologue, which is in turn the problem of the Agamemnon, is how exactly will it be possible to mix these two points of view together? The universality characteristic of the heavens on the one hand, with the particularity characteristic of human affairs on the other hand. Now, that's interesting because it gets mirrored once again in the status of the gods. So that line I've quoted to you several times now, where the chorus say something like Zeus, whatever he wants to be called, it shows up as the ambiguity that is in a way present in all Greek gods, but it's certainly present in this play in three instances. You have the word erunus, which means fury, and the plural would mean furies, and they turn out to be the furies are the chorus of gods in the third play. Ares, which means on the one hand means war, and on the other hand points to the god of war, and on the third hand, Hephaestus, which can stand for fire on the one hand, or on the other hand, stand for a god. You realize, I mean, in a way it's interesting when you think about it. Forget about Greek gods generally, but on the one hand, a god is, well, no, let's think about Greek gods. It's actually different when you get to the God that simply says, I am. But if you think about what makes the Greek gods interesting, in the first generation, you have ocean on the one hand and earth on the other hand. No, it's not ocean, I'm sorry. It's Ouranos, heaven, and Gaia, earth. And you realize as soon as you utter them that they could be nouns and they could be proper nouns. And if you talk about them as somehow responsible for doing things, you're treating them as though they're persons. But all of the mythology that comes out of that first generation might be interpreted simply as an attempt to make sense of the way things that exist in the world interact with one another. When you've got, we did this last time, when you've got earth, you've got something surrounding it. Whatever it is, even if it's a vacuum, you've got heaven. So heaven and earth are a sort of pair. You articulate that poetically as heaven and earth together generating, procreating in a way, a world which in the second generation is not Ouranos and Gaia, but Kronos and Rhea. Now, Kronos, of course, is with a kappa in Greek, but it's a sound alike for chronos, time, chronometer. And Rhea means something like flowing. So you see that you've still got a residue of names that mean something. They bring a kind of intelligibility to the world. When heaven and earth come together, the result is time. When Kronos when Uranos, male, and Gaia, female, come together and have children, the result is Kronos, the person. Third generation, it looks as though, in a way, you end up with gods who have proper names and they're much further from their sort of naturalistic origins. Zeus doesn't seem to stand for anything. That's why the chorus can say, Zeus, whatever you wish to be called, although Plato, in a dialogue called the Cratylus, makes it quite clear that the interesting thing about Zeus is that in the accusative, it's Zeus in the nominative, the case in which a subject would appear. If you take the case in which an object would appear, the accusative, it's dia, which can also mean on account of or through. We get via from it. And Plato, Socrates, actually in the dialogue, slides from that to the notion that, well, Zeus just means cause. But even there, you can see you've moved back from the notion of natural phenomena that get deified to a very, by the time you're talking about God as though the word for God is the same as the word for cause, you're getting very close to somehow whatever he wants to be called, this power that is responsible for things. So you think about it in a way, the gods are responsible for two things. They are meant to give an account of what causes things, and on the other hand, they are meant to give an account of the intelligibility of things, why things make sense, what things go together. Understood as fire, Hephaestus is part of the intelligible whole. There'll be a relation between fire and water and the various other natural phenomena. Understood as a god, this is a being who acts and makes things happen, to whom, for example, I mean, in a way, you can pray to Hephaestus, but it would be kind of silly to pray to fire. So the relation among the gods, I'm not sure why I went off on this long digression, you could say the distinction between gods as essences that make things intelligible versus gods, actors to whom one praise. So, you know that wonderful Botticelli painting of Venus and Mars? So you've got Venus, this is obviously after they've had sex together. Venus is lying down there looking very provocative, and Mars is kind of just completely bowled over, and he's got shields and helmets are lying around, and these little putti are climbing in them and playing with them, and all the important implements of war have been turned into playthings. It's in a way Botticelli's painting describing the power. So it's on the one hand a reference to something that we get a history of in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is in Phaeacia and giving an account of this love affair of for him, Aphrodite and Ares. So you could say love and war, understood in one way, are elemental, things that you have to understand if you're going to understand the world. They are, by the way, what the Iliad is about. The Greeks go off to Troy to fight because too many people have fallen in love with Helen, and the consequence is a devastating 10-year war. So the Iliad, in a way, is about love and war and the relation between the two. That's a relation of essential things, on the one hand. On the other hand, the way you articulate that poetically is to tell a story about how a certain kind of God falls for another kind of God. And so the doubleness of the way the gods are presented in poetry is somehow connected to the double perspective of the guard at the beginning, who looks at essential natures and looks at the human things. And we as spectators wonder, how do you fit those two things together? That's like the question, what does it mean to put a god together? A god has to, on the one hand, make sense, and on the other hand, be a person and a powerful person. What does it mean to put those two things together? It turns out, we don't quite see how yet, but it turns out that that's in some way the same as the question of justice, which requires, on the one hand, a particular situation, and on the other hand, unchanging, abiding, eternal principles in terms of which you understand that particular situation. So the Agamemnon from the beginning and in multiple ways is forcing you to ask that question. So you put it slightly differently. The problem of justice. And this we did last time. We have to be interested in how things turn out, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have to do that without sacrificing the kind of detachment without which there would be no fair assessment of the situation. But given the formula for how we learn that gets announced in the Agamemnon, pathe mathos, learning through sufferings, the question is how is that possible? Justice requires that you somehow be interested in the result, and on the other hand, that you be fair and utterly detached. The question hidden in the image you're presented with, as soon as the play opens, is essentially that question. And since, of course, this we also saw last time, justice is always experienced as a reaction to injustice, and since the injured always tend to overestimate their injuries, their judgment is necessarily suspect. And yet, justice is primarily of interest to those who are injured. So in a variety of different ways, we're being forced to ask the question at the beginning of a trilogy that is supposed to give us an account of justice, of the replacement of principles of vengeance by principles of justice. We are left to wonder what on earth it would mean for justice to be possible. You want to be really, really careful about, on the one hand, it's an old play, especially Aeschylus. It's hard to even think of it as a drama sometimes because it's so unlike our drama. It feels so alien and strange. It's easy to imagine that these are interesting literary questions. Oh, see what he just did. He showed us that the theme of the play is somehow connected with the opening scene and the elements of the opening scene. All that's fine and necessary and even quite wonderful when you push it. But it's also, it cuts much deeper. What's really being asked in the first pages of the Agamemnon is the question, is it possible for human beings ever to be just? This is not a scholarly question. This is a question that, depending on your answer, actually affects the way you live. Okay, so all of this, one more thing. Again, a repetition of what we've already seen. Justice always, therefore, because of the problems we've seen, gets understood in the following way. Well, just as A did B, I will do C. This is our adverbial decane, our like or just as. And what it points to is that there is always something irreducibly poetic about our understanding, our experience of justice. It involves a story within which there's an analogy. Reminds me of something we'll see in Aristotle. When he lists the parts of tragedy, he says the first and most important is muthos, plot or story, and second comes character. And usually at that point, we say, yeah, well, maybe for you, Aristotle, because you're not, you're not that sophisticated. You think story's the most important. But we understand that a drama can be much more about character, to which Aristotle, if he were able, he can't, so I'll do it for him. If Aristotle were able, he would say, but wait, tell me how exactly it is you can, I mean, if I ask you, what kind of person is your roommate? Isn't it the most effective way to answer that question to say, well, she's the kind of person who, and if you see what's in the subordinate clause, you realize it's just a story. That's how you get at who people are, by telling stories about them. But that means this is Aristotle's understanding of the priority of plot to character. It's not that character isn't important, it's just that the only way you have getting at it, and we'll see this over and over again, it's going to come up in this play, will certainly come up in the libation bearers. What's interesting is we're really interested in what's going on inside, let's say something like motive. And the problem turns out to be the only way to get to the inside is to articulate it in terms of the outside. When you want to understand who somebody is, you need to say what sort of thing they do, but that's to render in external terms something that you're understanding to be deeply internal and indeed invisible. So why is plot the most? Because that's the only game in town. It's the only way you can get at what you really want to get at. And by the way, it's not just other people. Think about the way you try to understand yourself. This I would do in the shower along with other things, right? You would say, why did I do that? I mean, you just think about how much time you spend thinking about who you are in terms of what you want to do, what you did, what you didn't do, what you resisted doing. Always when you're talking about doing, you're talking about actions. And I mean, there's a wonderful example of that is, there are lots of wonderful examples of that, but think about fear. Fear is a really internal thing, right? Think about how tempting it is to understand being afraid as what? As a kind of internal running away. Now, it can't be that. And here I'm going to invoke what I'm sorry to say is a scene in a Woody Allen movie, a scene that never existed, but I've used it for so many years as an example. It's a way in which your memory tricks you because you shove a whole bunch of things together that were never there. Anyway, it's supposed to be, according to me, in his movie Love and Death. Love and Death is Woody Allen's account of every huge Russian novel that was ever made. So it's got War and Peace and Crime and Punishment and Fathers and Sons. They're all shoved together into this movie, into an utterly preposterous mix. But in my memory, I had this scene. The scene is that Woody Allen is trying to escape. He's in the Russian army. The French have invaded Russia. He's trying to escape. So somehow he climbs into a cannon to hide, but they shoot him out of the cannon because he didn't know it was a cannon. So he ends up in the middle of the battle, in the middle of what looks like the French army. And because he's, of course, a coward, he turns tail and runs. But he's got his directions all mixed up because he doesn't know which way he's running. And he keeps running into these Russian soldiers who were rushing in the opposite direction. Turns out they're running away from the French. They look at him and say, if this little guy with the glasses can actually run toward the French, well, we certainly can do that. So they all turn around and the Russians win the battle and he's hailed as a hero. But in fact, it looks as though he's demonstrated extraordinary courage, but in fact, it's a product of his cowardice. So it turns out that we need to articulate internal things in external terms. We call that poetry. That's really what poetry does, on the one hand. Sing, goddess, the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles. Well, she doesn't talk about, oh boy, he was really angry. She gives an account of first his anger against Agamemnon, and then his anger, a series of angers throughout. But they're all in plot. So where was I? It turns out that these things that we really care about internally are only articulable for us externally, but the external articulation is never adequate because it always can, it's situation dependent. It's not clear why. I mean, being afraid is not simply running. Running away is not necessarily a sign that you're afraid. Running toward is not necessarily a sign that you're not afraid. And yet, think about your dreams. When you're terrified in your dreams, what are you doing most of the time? Even unselfconsciously, we articulate these things poetically in terms of something external that is the only way we have of talking about what we care about, but it's not an adequate way. Now, what's that's linked up with is the question, since A does B, just as A does B, I will do C, since that is in a way the form of our understanding of ourselves when we do justice, what's at stake is what the effect of this, you could say poetry is a necessary condition for understanding ourselves and other things as just, and it looks inadequate. So what does that mean about the status of justice? Now, this all points to the difficulty in understanding the Oresteia, the trilogy as a whole. If we read it absolutely straight, it turns out that the founding of the Athenian legal system is shown to rest on a justification for matricide. Orestes, at the end of the trilogy, gets off. He goes to trial, and he is found innocent. Aeschylus is absolutely and completely responsible for this story. The old story was the story of the Areopagus, same place, but different story. Areopagus means the hill of Ares, named because Ares was tried there by his fellow Olympian gods for slaying Poseidon's son, whose name I can't ever really pronounce well, Halorotheus, for attacking Ares' daughter Alcippe. Ares is also acquitted. So the puzzle we have to raise is, what's the connection between justice and matricide? What's the connection between killing the mother and justice? This is, again, somehow connected to the absolutely dominating presence of Clytemnestra in the trilogy. She's the only character who's in all three plays. I mentioned that last time. In the Agamemnon, at the very end, when it looks as though Aegisthus and the chorus are about to go to war with one another, there's this very serious quarrel. By sheer force of will, she shuts him down and says, no, we're not going to do that. In the Libation Bearers, when she hears that Aegisthus has been killed, she utters the memorable sentence, bring me an axe. So she's anything but passive. And in the Eumenides, in this the one appearance, she appears in a dream. The play opens with the Furies asleep. And you might well wonder, how can Furies be asleep? That would be like fire being cold. Furies are unrelenting, but the Furies are asleep, and they have a dream. And in the dream, Clytemnestra comes to them and says, what are you doing? You can't be asleep. Furies don't sleep. And so she scolds the scolds in the beginning of the Eumenides. She remains completely consistent throughout the trilogy. even when it's to her own detriment. So we see her in this play taking revenge on Agamemnon for killing Iphigenia. Now, the problem, and they're well aware of it early on, is Orestes. She could have solved this problem and saved her coup if she had had Orestes killed as a child. But she doesn't do it. Opening of the libation bearers, we'll see that she trusts Electra to pour libations to Agamemnon's at Agamemnon's funeral, at his tomb. So even though we're introduced to her as by the chorus, remember that memorable line 10 where it's not the chorus, it's the guard who says she has a male heart. She is consistently, throughout the trilogy, the mother. Our general question then is what this tension between motherhood and justice means. We have expressions like a face only a mother could love. And we have TV experiences where you watch a Law and Order episode where some particularly awful monster is being tried for murder, and for whatever reason they have in the front row his mother who wants him to get off and cries when he's convicted. And nobody thinks of thinking that this woman is a monster because she wants a monster to get off. It's somehow okay to side with your children, even when they're really terrible. So that's okay. That doesn't bother us. It doesn't strike us as inconsistent. We want him to get convicted and put away, and she doesn't, and we don't hate her for wanting him to get off. It's not simply mother in this play. And this is the issue that we have to be both skeptical of, because we will be skeptical of it, and somehow listen to it on the other hand, because the play is so saturated with it. So if you look on page 28, you get this. Top of the page, line 10. And the tidings of her capture, for such is the rule of a woman's man counseling ever hopeful heart. And then next time, I'm not getting all of them, I just want to show you how saturated the play is. On page 48, you get this. Such is the tale you hear from me, a woman. And on page 55, we get this. It is like a woman's rule to join in approving thanksgiving before the thing is manifest. And on page 61, you get this. Indeed, it is like a woman to let her feelings carry her away. And on page 74, you get this. These are obviously said by many different people, some of them by Clytemnestra herself. Bottom of the page, men of the city, lords of Argos, here I shall feel no shame to speak to you of the love I bear my husband, for in time timidity dies away for the humankind. It is not from others that I have learned. I shall speak of my own sorrow, so long as this man was beneath Ilium. First, for a woman far from her husband to sit in her house alone is a fearful grief, hearing many a malignant rumor. And then on 79 at the top, it is not a woman's part to desire contention. And then on page 104, we get this. You make a trial of me as though of a foolish woman. And then the last, no, not the last, on 115, we get this. the chorus at the top, woman, do you do this to those newly returned from battle, keeping the house and shaming the husband's bed? Did you plot this death for the general? And then, bottom of the page, why with your cowardly heart did you not kill this man yourself, but with you, he's talking to Aeschylus, but with you, a woman, polluting the land and its gods, killed him. And the final one on the last page, such is the saying of a woman, if any condescend to hear it. Now, so we've got the tension between justice and motherhood, don't understand it quite yet, although we begin to see where it might come from. And then he sort of ups the ante and makes the issue the tension between male and female. Then we have to understand that. Okay, let's turn to the text, to what's clearly a terribly important, but really hard to make out scene. It's usually called the carpet scene, line 782 through 974. Now the chorus begin by indicating that Agamemnon might have trouble. They aren't mad at him. They say they aren't mad at him anymore. One wonders why not. All of their offspring have died. 99 of 100 ships are gone after this 10-year war. But they warn him, they say that unnamed others behaved inappropriately while he was gone. That's at line 807 on page 72. Maybe we'll just read that quickly and not read too much. And in time you shall learn by inquiry which of the citizens has guarded the city justly and which has failed to keep the proper limit. And they mean Clytemnestra. Now, she warns him too when she explains why Orestes isn't there. She says, well, you know, there was talk of opposition in the city and I sent him away for his own safety. That's at line 75. So Agamemnon is aware of the possibility of civil unrest. Then she tries to get him to step, when he's getting out of the chariot, to step on the tapestry and walk into the house. The carpet. She praises him as the sacker of Troy and says, don't let your feet touch the ground. She urges instead that he let justice lead him into his house on a carpet. I think Lloyd Jones translates it as purple. The root for it is the same as our word porphyry. So purple, red, dark red, it's hard to know exactly what the color is. It's in some dramas, it's clear that it's meant to be the color of blood, but you know, blood comes in different colors depending on whether it's fresh or old. Now, she tries to get him to walk in on this tapestry, this, I'll call it a red carpet, and Agamemnon scolds her and says, that's not your role to say that. So you think about this for a minute, and he hasn't seen her for 10 years. He hasn't seen her since before he killed Iphigenia. She's been running the show quite successfully in Argos for 10 years. And the first words he says to her are effectively, keep your place, woman. If you ever thought that Agamemnon was particularly tactful, this and the way he casually introduces Cassandra's, oh, by the way, I brought this with me, is a sign that he's not particularly. Then he says, no, I'm not going to walk on that carpet. Such things are for barbarians, people like the Trojans, who, he says, are made soft like women on the one hand, and fail to distinguish between themselves and gods on the other hand. So presumably, a non-barbarian, a Greek, to be a non-barbarian, a Greek, means not to make this mistake, not to fall into the mistake of behaving like a woman and not to fall into the mistake of thinking you're like a god. Now, at this point, Clytemnestra and Agamemnon seem to have made it a contest of wills, and it looks like it's going to be a stalemate. Clytemnestra says, "So are you afraid of the gods?" You would think that the loss of 99 ships and the command to kill Iphigenia might have made him a little afraid of the gods, but she taunts him, "Are you afraid of the gods?" And then she asks, what would Priam do? What would Priam have done under a similar circumstance? And Agamemnon has to allow that Priam would have done it. He would have walked on the tapestry. So Clytemnestra is really asking Agamemnon, aren't you as great as Priam was? So she appeals to his envy. Then she counters his worries about what the people will say, which, by the way, she's been trying to engender. She's trying to engender a kind of opposition to him. She says to him, people like you have to expect to be envied. The great will always be envied, Agamemnon. Don't worry about it. So finally he gives in. Why, though? We have multiple, she says, don't be afraid of the gods. She says, don't, and she tries to get him to be envious of Priam. He gives in and walks on the tapestry, but it's peculiar because he doesn't say, well, I'll walk on it because we don't know what his motive is. It's important, though, because everything turns on it. Let's start over. What's Clytemnestra actually after? What's she trying to do? On the one hand, she wants to get him to do what will lose the people's support. She wants him to act like a conquering hero when he's returned without their relatives and with one ship. Although, since she couldn't have known about the storm, she can't have known in advance how bad it would be. On the other hand, she has not seen him since Iphigenia. She wants to learn something by this whole ruse, learn something about him. What does she want to learn about him? Let's start over in a different way. When do you think she decided to kill him? If she decided to kill him when he killed Iphigenia, then since she couldn't have known, I'll get in a sec, right? Since she couldn't have known about the shipwrecks or about Menelaus not coming home, and since we know early on from that passage about the eagles that Agamemnon and Menelaus are said to rule jointly in Argos. So if all that's true, she could still have killed him, but she would have had to expect to be killed in return. So if she decided when you suspect, she decided, it would have been, in effect, expressing a willingness to die. It doesn't matter. We all think about it. I mean, we don't think about it in the sense that we're actually going to do it. But so I think it's like all decisions. I mean, if I tell you, I'm going to go over there and I'm going to open that door, right? I'm going to open it. I've decided. When do you know that I decided it? I mean, I could just be fooling you until I do. Well, I'm not going to do it, see? So this is the poetry problem again. You want to know something that's sort of presumably going on in me, and it looks as though in order to understand what's going on in me, the moment when you know that I intended to open the door is when I open it. Before that, it could always be a trick, a ruse. You see, what's going on is we want to know what it means to understand a motive. And I choose that word intentionally because you remember this trilogy ends with a trial. Motives are rather important for trials. Now, so at first, it seems as though she decided to do it before he returns. On second thought, there's something about the situation which makes us wonder whether she hasn't just decided to do it. If she didn't intend to die and decides now to kill him, then it looks as though this whole tapestry business is meant to be a test. A test. What sort of a test? An attempt to discover his motive. It looks as though, in a strange way, whatever she's doing with the tapestry is meant to teach her something about, let me put it in this way. Suppose she's trying to decide whether to kill him. To decide whether to kill him, maybe she needs to know why he killed Iphigenia. She wasn't there, she didn't see it. So it looks as though the whole carpet scene is meant in Clytemnestra's mind to in some way reproduce the situation under which he killed Iphigenia and show her what his motive was for doing that. It's hard to see that at first glance. It's a very difficult, it's interesting. It's so often in Aeschylus, it's such a crucial moment for the plot, and yet it's very unclear what you're meant to learn from it. So back to page 77. Let's read it this time. Offspring of Leda, this is at line 914. Guardian of my house, your speech matches my absence, for you have drawn it out at length. That's the first thing he says to his wife after he hasn't seen her for 10 years. Stop talking so much. But to give me fitting praise, that is an honor that should come from others, and for the rest, do not in a woman's fashion pamper me. Do not, as if I were a barbarian, gape at me with prostrations and loud cries. Do not, by strewing my path with raiment, make it exposed to envy. It is the gods you should honor with such things, and to walk being a mortal on embroidered splendors, it is impossible for me without fear. I tell you to honor me with honors human, not divine, apart from foot wipers and embroideries. The voice of fame resounds, and good sense is the god's greatest gift. Now, to step on the tapestry, apparently Agamemnon thinks would be a sign that he's a woman and soft. Or to step on the tapestry would indicate that he's a barbarian. Or to step on the tapestry would indicate that he thinks he's a god. So he doesn't want to do it, but he can't seem to decide why not to do it. It's either too low, the tapestry is for wiping your feet, or it's too high, the tapestry is embroidery. Now, what does she expect to learn from this reenactment, from this situation? So she wants to know why Agamemnon did it, his motive. she can't know that from the reports. Put it in this way. Did he kill Iphigenia out of some dire necessity in order to ensure justice was done? And did he really do it because the gods forced him to? That would make him a servant, a lowly servant of the gods, simply doing what he has to do. He might not like doing it, but might feel that he has to do it. Or did he do it all for his own glory, for his own self-interest? If so, he would have been using Iphigenia as a sort of tool for his own benefit. So Clytemnestra here puts him on trial to reveal his inner motive, because the character of his crime is completely dependent upon that motive. Now, this issue, let's jump now, gets clearer in the Cassandra section, which runs from 1035 to 1330. That's almost exactly 200, that's a little under 300 lines. Now, the Agamemnon is a long Greek tragedy, the longest extant Greek tragedy, I think. It's 1,700 lines. The average Greek tragedy is about 1,500 lines, which means this one runs about 200 lines long, longer than the average. Think about what happens in the exchange between the chorus and Cassandra. There are a lot of interesting things said, but it affects the actual plot movement not at all. Nothing happens that changes anything in this section, which means from a certain point of view, Aeschylus could have left the whole thing out, and he would have written a tragedy of more or less average length. So he obviously didn't want to leave it out, which means he thinks it's important. And yet, as we saw, it's unclear exactly what its importance is, so we need to think about it. Now, Clytemnestra, in the part that leads up to this, fails to win over the chorus because she never makes a connection between the injustice of the war, their dead children, and the sacrifice of Iphigenia. It would have been a pretty easy connection to make, but she doesn't make it. And they clearly feel this injustice. Look at lines 60 to 65. They might well have sided with her. But she loses her chance once they talk to Cassandra. Cassandra somehow convinces them that the real issue is the curse on the house of Atreus. Now, at first, the chorus are bewildered because they don't see what this has to do with anything. But gradually, they get convinced that the issue is the revenge of Aeschylus on Agamemnon for the killing of Thyestes by Agamemnon's father, Atreus. So that points to the fact that the issue, and Cassandra is largely responsible for this, becomes Clytemnestra's adultery. This is, of course, interesting because of the total silence about Iphigenia. The scene is very beautifully done because they're about to see what it means for an innocent girl to go to her death. But this, what they see, is blotted out by what she says. So Cassandra has the effect of making the Agamemnon a domestic tragedy. Clytemnestra's motive is now not justice at all and not linked at all to the question of the war. Cassandra short-circuits the direction then that the carpet scene had begun to take. So how exactly does Iphigenia and the question of Iphigenia get suppressed? Now, Cassandra has visions. her visions are peculiar. On the one hand, she seems to see the whole history of the house of Atreus all the way back to Tantalus. You know, Tantalus was the man who tried to trick the gods by cutting up his son and putting him into a stew. And all the gods, which one? I think it might have been Demeter, I'm not sure, forgotten. All of them can tell immediately that it's human flesh. One of them takes a bite of shoulder, and therefore they punish Tantalus. He goes to Hades, and he's the one who is forever, reaching for the fruit from a tree that is constantly receding from him. So it's a sort of image of this, and Sisyphus are the images of a kind of eternal frustration. So he's punished. They put his son Pelops back together again and give him an artificial prosthetic shoulder because she ate his shoulder. And then he goes off to Greece, where he ends up falling in love with, what's her name? I've got it somewhere. Oenomaus' daughter, Hippodamia. But Oenomaus uses her as a means to enthrall these young men, whom he gets them to bet their lives on a chariot race, which they always lose because of his extraordinary horses. But Pelops fools him, wins, kills the king, marries the girl, and becomes the founder of the Peloponnese in Greece. His sons are Atreus and Thyestes. Atreus is cheated by Thyestes, and Thyestes in rebellion to acquire the kingship, and Thyestes sleeps with Atreus's wife. Atreus, in revenge, slaughters Thyestes' children and feeds him these children, all of these sons, all of them but one, Aeschylus. Aeschylus then returns to kill Atreus. Agamemnon, the son of Atreus, becomes the king, and Aeschylus comes back, and the rest of the story from the Agamemnon. So on the one hand, Cassandra seems to see this whole history of the house of Atreus all the way back to Tantalus. She seems to have the experience of events over time that is sort of like the evening out of justice that we talked about last week. And yet, she leaves out Iphigenia and makes Clytemnestra, therefore, seem completely adulterous. This suggests that her vision, really like real vision, is limited. It turns out to be limited to the place where she is. She gets the whole curse on the house of Atreus when she's in the house of Atreus. She knew a lot of things about Troy when she was in Troy, but Iphigenia was killed in Aulis, and she doesn't seem to, that doesn't seem to make it into her visions. So her vision is not narrowly perspectival, but on a higher level, it too is perspectival. The sign of this is not only the absence of Iphigenia from these visions, but Cassandra herself. You could say Cassandra has every reason to hate Agamemnon. After all, he led the army that killed Priam and Priam's 50 sons and carried off the daughters and burned down the city. Why can't she simply think of Clytemnestra as an instrument of justice avenging Troy? It'd be a perfectly natural thing to do. Why on earth is she taking the side of Agamemnon? Now, this is all connected to a third thing. What's peculiar about all the male crimes of the house of Atreus is that they all seem to use children as instruments of policy. They can do this because the children are identifiable as property. Only because Agamemnon in some way owns Iphigenia can he use her the way he does. Otherwise, it would simply be murder. But precisely because she is his, as his daughter, he shouldn't use her as he does. So let's start over. Why do they go to war? They go to war because of Helen's adultery. And the chorus are outraged by Clytemnestra's adultery. And yet Cassandra is rather casually introduced as an afterthought by Agamemnon, lines 950 to 57. Why aren't they outraged by his adultery? Well, it turns out, it looks as though the reason, this is Rousseau's famous and rather disturbing defense of the double standard. This is in the 5th book of Emile, with regard to the question of chastity, which it looks as though he wants to say, yeah, it's important for men, but it's really important for women. And that we're used to that double standard, don't like it very much. But Rousseau does, in a way, point to not a justification, but the rationale. Once you make the assumption that the most important thing is the preservation of the family, it turns out that with regard to children, the role of male and female are quite different, because the father can only be certain that the children are his if he trusts the chastity of the mother, because otherwise they could be anybody's children. No, of course it doesn't work. That we're headed in that direction, right? But no, that certainly doesn't work if you're going to kill your kid. On the one hand, and on the other hand, if it's a real sacrifice, it can only be a real sacrifice if it's your kid. That shows that it's a real sacrifice, because if it's another sacrifice, you just get out and get somebody else's kid and kill them. So in order for the gods to ask for it and make it the most terrible thing they could ask for, he has to know that it's his child. So it's a very strange situation that we're in. So at first glance, the Oresteia seems to be an attack on the family in the name of the city. The attachment to the particular, to one's blood relations, has to be supplanted by a system of justice. That's what it would mean to replace the rule of vengeance by the rule of law. So symbolically, the mother has to be killed. The father stands to the mother as the city stands to the family, as the watchman looking up stands to the watchman looking down. That's what you think is happening. But what we see is that, in fact, this is what I was trying to bring out in response to your remark. What we see is that, in fact, Agamemnon can only wage war by using what is his only by virtue of family attachment. So it looks as though he's defying family attachment, but the only way he can do it is by presupposing family attachment. So start over. Why does justice involve an attack on the mother? Loyalty to place, Cassandra and the house of Atreus, is ultimately rooted not in place, but in kinship. Agamemnon goes to war because his brother's wife commits adultery. And Agamemnon can go to war because he can atone for his sins, whatever they were, we still don't know, with his offspring. So only because Iphigenia is related will it work. Now, since allegiance to place, to Argos, for example, gives you only a higher order perspectival vision, Think about Cassandra's failure to ask if Clytemnestra might be the avenger of Troy. For justice really to prevail, this allegiance too would have to be subverted. And yet the only thing that's powerful enough to subvert it seems to be rooted in it. Seems to be what Clytemnestra sees. Agamemnon is as perspectival in his vision as she is in hers. And so the play, Agamemnon, finally looks not so much like an account of the political Agamemnon versus the familial Clytemnestra, as an account of the way in which the principle of the family, love of one's own, is at odds with itself. So you might put the issue of the trilogy this way. How is it possible to put together the experience of revenge, which is somehow tied to the attachment to one's own because it is one's own, and only possible because we feel this connectedness to other human beings through the family, in other words, the mother? How is it possible to put this together with justice, which involves universal principles and disinterested judgment? How is it possible to take a personal interest in justice without turning it into vengeance or perhaps ambition? Or what is the real life equivalent of the carpet scene? Without a personal interest, how can justice ever exist? So justice seems to require something like mother killing, but in the Oresteia, mother killing is rooted in the attachment to the mother. In this case, the only link to the father. We need the libation bearers, the coephori, that's the Greek title, for the next installment, and we turn there on Wednesday. Before, I'm going to stop and let you ask some questions, but before, three things that didn't somehow fit in along the way but are worth noticing. Notice the complete failure of Clytemnestra's trial. She gets Agamemnon to reproduce the sacrifice of Iphigenia by walking on the tapestry, and his motive remains as dark now as it was 10 years ago. Notice how the chorus behave with Cassandra. You had to notice it. You're reading these 300 lines or so, and she's saying essentially, you know, she's going to kill Agamemnon, and they're saying, oh, how dark your expressions are. We don't understand anything you're talking about. It is very, very strange. And finally, this really interesting. There's no way you can know this yet. Most of you haven't read enough Greek tragedy to know it, but what happens when they hear, the chorus hear the shouts from in the house, and they realize that Agamemnon's being killed, or they sort of wonder whether he's being killed. For the only time in an extant Greek tragedy, they break up into 12 voices. And they can't agree on what's happening. The way it's posed, it looks as though Clytemnestra stabs him or in some way attacks him 3 times. We have some reason to believe that if they had intervened before the 3rd time, they might have saved his life, but they can't get it together. They can't agree. They can't act as a jury. That's what happened in the last play. A jury will sort of decide, although your translator fudges it. Most translators do. They just can't believe it. They present it as though the jury ties and Athena breaks the tie. But in fact, I think if you read the Greek as it looks as though the jury is a jury of 11, since they're not the chorus, they don't have to be 12. The jury of 11, and it looks as though they vote 6-5 to find him guilty, and she votes to make it a tie in order to establish the view that you need a majority in order to convict, and therefore a tie is essentially an acquittal. And in order to make the margin of acquitting as small as possible so the Furies won't be too angry with her. But here, we're a long way from there. Here we have 12 members of the chorus running around uttering separate lines, and that just doesn't happen. Uttering separate lines and one saying, what are we going to do? I don't know, is she killing her? Back and forth, they can't decide what to do, and the consequence is that she ends up killing him. So you could say one way to understand the movement of the trilogy is that in the first play, you have 12 people who can't act as a unit, and by the third play, they can. And what makes that possible is apparently what makes justice possible. So I think I'm gonna, we haven't finished, you never finish. We spent 2 days on an incredibly hard, I once spent a whole semester on this play, but not for a long time. Yeah, well, those are issues that it's important to raise. I think that you want to notice the tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, get hit pretty hard for this, but in fact, let me just repeat the fact that the single most impressive character in this trilogy, without any exception, is Clytemnestra. So the issue of misogyny may be there, but you want to be very careful about thinking that Aeschylus is in favor of it. He's aware of it. He's aware of the role that women play. So if we abstract from that, I think that what one has to ask is this. Even if the results are socially unjust, let's ask ourselves what might have led at the beginning to the distinction that's being made. And I think that it's fair to say that without committing oneself to the justice of what it's used for, that Aeschylus is reflecting on the fact that families are extraordinarily important for human beings, that the coherence of the family depends on the view that the children of this family are not the same as the children of that family. So like it or not, otherwise you end up in a situation where the family isn't this crucial social unit, that in fact you could imagine a communism in the way Marx imagines it, or the way Plato imagines it in Book 5 of the Republic. But if you're insisting on the family as a crucial social unit, there has to be some way of holding it together, and it turns out that the mother plays a more crucial role than the father, just by virtue of the fact that that her connection to the children is undeniable in a way that his isn't. So she is, in a way, the cement of the family. The fact that in so many cultures, certainly in Greece it was true as well, in so many cultures, the family bears the name of the father is a sign of a compensation. He needs that because that makes it look as though he's the principal of the family. But the only reason he has to assert that is because it's so obviously not true. So once you see that, if it's the case that the role in childbirth means that the connection between mother and children is more undeniable than it is for the father, then it turns out that insofar as the principle of the family is something like loving your own because they're your own. That's what I meant earlier by saying, you love your sister because you're a sister, but you don't choose her the way you would choose a friend. You have criteria for choosing friends. I like you because you're X, Y, and Z, but there's something more primordial present with the family because you're born into it. It's just the way things are. So if it turns out that that the mother is in some way identifiable as the principle of this social unit, that as the cement of this social unit, of which the principle is love of your own because it's your own, then it looks as though the claim is that for justice to prevail, the hold that love of your own, because it's your own, has on you has to be broken. Because you cannot prefer what someone did over what someone else did just because you have an affection for that person. Now, if it's interesting, by the way, that on the one hand shows up in Book 5 of Plato's Republic, but it shows up in Marx too. It's why the ultimate ultimately the withering away of the state, but even before that, the withering away of the family, because the relation between the preference for a family member over another is in some way irrational. So justice, if it were to be perfect justice, would have to kill that principle. Aeschylus has seen that, but he's seen something else. He's also seen that the vehicle you use to kill that principle is the city, which is his own version of, it's a reenactment of that principle. The fact that you're more loyal to Athenians or Argives than you are to Trojans is somehow not based on a universal principle. It too is based on a partial principle, so that it's not as though Aeschylus thinks that political life is successful in annihilating love of one's own because it's one's own. He's analyzing the temptation, the need to do that in order to justify what you're doing as just. Oh, they can be dense because they think that such things are done by the active principle, not the passive principle. So they are dense. They're dense because they're assuming it. It's the same thing that leads them to give her what credit they give her by saying, wow, you have a manly heart. So I think that what Aeschylus is doing is they're certainly dense in all sorts of ways. They don't get this. And it looks as though part of the reason they don't get it is because they don't understand her. They can't understand her because they can't see how someone, and Agamemnon didn't understand her either. He got home, look, this is a woman who has run Argos for 10 years. He gets home and he says, shut up, woman. It's just, what you need to see is that Aeschylus is as startled by it. I mean, he means to make this clear. It's not as though he's approving of it. He's trying to show that something happens. Typically, it is in a way the arrogance of political life, you could say, that thinks that it can transcend the family, but can't, if it stopped for a moment to think, it realized it couldn't get any citizens. I mean, it thinks of Argives as citizens, but they're not citizens. They're human beings, and they're born because a male human being and a female human being get together in a certain sort of way, and they generate offspring. And without that, there is no city. Where do the citizens of the city come from, if not from sexual intercourse? And yet the city somehow blindly believes that all citizens are, and the minute you have that, you have two kinds of preference sneaking in. The minute you allow eros in, you allow sex in, you allow eros in. You allow eros in, eros creates a situation in which one human being prefers another human being to all the other human beings. This doesn't lead to the fraternité of political life on the one hand, and on the other hand, after all is said and done, you have babies and you have an affection for your own. You love your own. And it looks as though the great myth of political life is that all of that can be simply transcended on the one hand, and on the other hand, it has to be transcended because it's cute when you do it with your baby. It's not so cute if you excuse certain people for behaving brutishly because they're your family and you treat other people differently. Equality under the law, justice as a minimum requires equality under the law. Equality under the law is at odds with the preferential treatment that is built into erotic longing on the one hand and having children on the other hand.